of understanding family resilience within families where a parent has a mental illness. Today she will describe the prevalence of parents with a mental illness and will highlight a shift in focus in the research field from understanding the risks for children to now exploring the benefits of early intervention and focusing on building resilience in children. We will also discuss a brief parent recovery intervention that she is trialing in Australia that aims to equip parents with the confidence and skills to support their family with the support of the mental health provider. Dr. Goodyear has been working as a researcher in the area of families where a parent has a mental illness since 2003. She has a background in psychology and recently completed her PhD in neuroscience. She is currently a research fellow at Monash University working on a randomized control trial of the parent intervention Let's Talk About Children for mental health services. She is also an adjunct researcher at the Bouverie Center, La Trobe University, working on workforce development projects that will promote well-being in vulnerable families. Welcome, Dr. Goodyear. It's very nice to have you.
Thank you, Debbie. As Debbie mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a bit today about understanding family resilience. As she also mentioned, we've been doing a little bit of work around how to support families where a parent has a mental illness. And one of our more recent approaches is really focusing on how we can build a bit of understanding, I guess, about how families develop strength through the potential adversity of mental illness. There's also a relatively new movement called family recovery, which we're also sort of trying to influence through this work. Thanks for listening, everyone. Before I begin, I want to thank the International Bipolar Foundation. It's fantastic to get the opportunity to share some of this research with you, but also I encourage all of you, where possible, to support the foundation. Really, they're really doing some fantastic work, not only in connecting people and sharing people's stories, but also in their education program and resources, and particularly in combating the stigma of mental illness. So as Debbie mentioned, I work with my colleagues Daryl Mabry and Andrea Rupert at Monash University, but I'm also fortunate to be connected with the Bouverie Centre. And I'll work with some fantastic clinical leaders there, Rose Cuff, Hannah Jewell. Also the FATMI team is connected there through Becca Alchin and a number of other FATMI workers who are really working hard to change our mental health system to be more family inclusive. And I just want to acknowledge the great work that they're doing and how much they've informed the field. As I said, I've got a keen interest in research where we can look at promoting recovery for FATMI. So FATMI is what I'll refer to as families where a parent has a mental illness. I think this is a really important step for the field, but also we want to translate that work into developing mental health services to really be inclusive of the family. And I'm fortunate to be part of an international team that are really looking worldwide at how we can change the mental health system to have more sensitive practices. Also, as Debbie mentioned, I'm part of a research group. I'm leading the research as the project manager and principal researcher of a randomised control trial, which hopefully I'll get to a bit later on today. It's a really important program that we want to sort of share with you as well. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you a bit about today is what we know of the prevalence data of FATMI and children of parents with a mental illness, what we know about the benefits of early intervention, and why we are now focusing on family resilience. The main part of my talk is actually sharing some recent findings from a family resilience project that we've done. And what I'll do throughout the presentation is share stories that have come from interviews from adults who have grown up or reflecting on growing up in a household where a parent has a mental illness. The large majority of them are reflecting on having a parent with bipolar disorder, so I'm going to share those particular stories with you today. We've also been fortunate to interview a number of clinical leaders and really capture their wisdom about what are resilience promoting and hindering factors. for family resilience. And then I'll finish talking a little bit about a model that's a parent recovery model. I also want to say that the talk is a little bit about contextualising resilience. So while I'm interested in finding out strengths and talking to you all about the strengths, we also find throughout this research that we're engaging with the difficult times for families as well. So in a sense, sometimes parts of these stories can be difficult for people to hear, and I just want to sort of acknowledge that at the beginning. Okay, so what do we know about prevalence? So a population-based study in the US found that over 65% of women and over 50% of men who were diagnosed with a mental health disorder in their lifetime were parents. We also know from our prevalence studies in mental health services, so current clients, that about a fifth to a third of those clients are parents parenting with a mental illness. So what we know from those studies is that we're talking about a fifth of all Australian children are living with at least one parent with a mental illness. Now those figures are comparable internationally. In the UK, up to 1 in 4 children aged between 5 and 15 years were likely to have a mother at risk of a mental health problem. So as I mentioned, we're talking about 20% of Australian children. Some of the research is indicating that these children are at greater risk of developing emotional, social and behavioural issues, and in some cases can go on to develop their own mental health issues. So the risk appears to be about 2 to 3 times higher than the general population. A recent study that sort of looked at an overview of a number of studies, a number of risk studies, looked into children of parents with a serious mental illness, and their recent evidence suggests that there's about a 32% chance of these children developing their own serious mental illness. But I think what's important to acknowledge here is that some families manage the challenges of mental illness really quite well. And it's important to remember that not all children face situations of risk. Not all children face situations that translate into difficulties, and in some cases, and in a lot of cases, children can actually develop a number of strengths through the process as well. It's sort of what's commonly referred to as growth through adversity in the resilience literature. A really, really recent study published last week actually looked at strengths that children of parents who are hospitalised in an Iranian psychiatric hospital in Iran, obviously, found that they tended to develop strengths in the areas of sort of developing greater independence as young adults, and also they tended to show a sense of greater compassion and empathy. So there's some evidence that they're quite considerate of others' needs. Okay, so what we do know from the research is that we know that selectively targeted prevention programs for children at risk show the best results. A recent analysis of randomised control trials of family, couple and parenting interventions actually found that children, when it looked at children's outcome, it showed that both emotional and behavioural symptoms were reduced, and the risk of developing the same mental illness as their parent was reduced by about 40%. Now, 2 of those interventions that they looked at were the evidence for Let's Talk about children, the parent recovery model, and Family Talk, which you may know about in the States. A guy called Bill Beardsley, has developed over there. I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that these family or parent interventions really are quite effective. So it really highlights to me the importance of strength-based interventions and also working to support important relationships in people's lives, and how that can actually lead to better mental health outcomes. I just quickly want to draw your attention to This is our national Cottony initiative. So Cottony is Children of Parents with a Mental Illness. They have a number of fantastic resources on their site, a number of education courses as well, and they actually have training packages for those two interventions that I was talking about. So there's an freely available e-learning course on Let's Talk About Children, which I'm showing you now, and also Family Focus, which is the Australian version of Family Talk. Okay, so why the focus on family resilience? As we sort of said, that Cottony field, the children of parents with a mental illness, really is starting to move away from a risk-averse focus to more of this strength-based framework and looking at sort of a broader focus beyond individual well-being to the family and community and the interactions between them. So as I mentioned previously, we know that intervention can result in better outcomes for children. We know a lot more about the factors that promote individual resilience, but actually little is known about the impact of these interventions in the family context. Now, this is particularly important, as you can imagine. The family context will be, in most cases, the context for which these children continue to develop and will continue to have a strong influence. So I think one of the issues for the research field is really to better understand the impact of mental illness on the family, the ways that we can support those families, and importantly, the ways that they can help themselves, sort of assisting with family recovery. And when I say family recovery, it's sort of assisting the whole family to live with the impact of mental illness. The family resilience framework is particularly attractive because it's strength-based, it's family inclusive, it focuses on interactions between the individual, family and social influences. Importantly, it presumes diversity in what we call family, so we all have sometimes different arrangements in what we call family, and so it really acknowledges that as well. And I think the final thing that's attractive to me about this framework is that it presumes there are many different pathways to resilience, so there isn't sort of necessarily one appropriate pathway. So the Family Resilience Project, essentially it's about teasing out a clearer understanding of what family resilience might mean to families where a parent has a mental illness. It's about what is it about the family that enables them to cope with or manage the difficult times? What is it about the family dynamics that best supports all members of that family to be okay? We were fortunate to obtain some funding at Bouverie from La Trobe University for this work. We had 10 semi-structured interviews with adults who had grown up in a household where a parent had a mental illness and 11 senior clinicians who were working with FATMI. Just to give you a bit of context to our data, I guess, we had a fairly wide age range. Mostly females were the adults that sort of volunteered for the study, but they came from families with a wide socioeconomic background. So there was a single parent on a pension to upper middle class, high income families, and it was interesting because they all sort of experienced stress, but the influences are slightly different. Mostly mothers with the mental health problem. The majority, about 70% of them, were families where there was bipolar disorder. Most of them would recall their parent either having a diagnosis prior to their birth or in their early childhood years. Now, none of the interviewees had a diagnosis themselves, but all would say that they've sought counselling throughout their lives for the impact of mental illness. So to better understand the strength and resilience processes within families, there is a person called Froma Walsh from Chicago who's written a lot about the concept of family resilience. And we really use this to shape our understanding of families where a parent has a mental illness. But she talks about three, I guess, key processes: belief systems within the family, organisational patterns within the family, and communication and problem solving. So belief systems are about the family's ability to make meaning of the adversity, having a positive outlook, having spirituality or a belief in something bigger. So that's sort of this concept of transcendence. So things are sort of happening for a higher purpose. Organisational patterns are the family's ability to be flexible when needed, to change routines when needed, a sense of having a sense of connectedness and mutual support within the family, and the social and economic resources available to the family. Excuse me, sorry about that. Communication and problem solving is about clarity of communication within the family, open emotional expression, and collaborative problem solving. So what we looked at is whether the families that we were interviewing had the same sort of consistent processes and strengths, and whether there was anything unique to families where a parent has a mental illness. And I'd say that, we started by asking people to speak generally about their family experiences. From a strength-based perspective, we asked them about what worked well in their family, what was going on when things were good. Some of the interviews were quite moving, were quite long, and they were really quite a powerful exercise both for the participants and us as researchers. And what tend to come up is that people really had never had much opportunity to talk about the positive things that were going on, that had been going on in their family. But also, in most cases, the conversations happened by really first drawing on the negative experiences for them and their family. This seemed to be quite prominent in their mind prior to them being able to talk about the strengths. So really this theme that came up quite strongly was this combination of both stress alongside resilience. Now for children and parents with bipolar disorder, sometimes they recall that there were good times when the parent might have been in a more manic phase. Some of the research indicates that parents talk about having more energy to parent. And this is a quote from Sally. I've changed the names of people to protect their identity. Sally lived with her mother, who was a single parent, living with bipolar in a rural location. So she would say, so there's so many times when I wake up in the morning and she'd still be awake and there'd be some crazy new dress, or she'd knocked down half the wall and done something to the kitchen. All sorts of mad things she'd come up with, which as a kid I thought was great because, no one else had parents who did things like that in the middle of the night. But that was probably not a good thing in a roundabout way. We can see, I guess, from Sally's story that at times her mother's behaviour inspired and entertained Sally, gave her a sense, I think importantly, that her family was special. The memory, though, of this was still strong even when she was talking as a young adult. She's aware that her mother's actions were related to her mental illness, and in some ways there's a bit of a dark edge to the story in this context. So the other side is that her mother's erratic behaviour may have been a sign that she mightn't have been managing her mental illness quite well, and may have led, Sally would talk about it, may have led to difficult consequences later on. Okay, so if we look at what is familiar with Froma Walsh's framework, another interesting finding that emerged was the way that families, despite that shame and stigma around mental illness, really tried to hang on to a strong sense of their family identity, so really tried to belong to something positive. And it's sort of this concept of the family being special that was prominent amongst adults who grew up in a household with a parent with bipolar. And this is Scott. Scott had a mother with bipolar, and when we tease out the belief systems in his family, they were very much framed around this family identity and culture. You'll see that the family formed an understanding or framework of belief around the mother's mental illness in how they saw their family as upper class or a bit above others in the community. So this is what he had to say. I think there were times when I would have known she was a bit different, but it was couched more as a bit sort of glamorous. What comes to mind in that is we had money It was sort of old money in the sense that they never had a good car. So because we had this upper class sensibility, there was some sense about who we thought Mum was. She was a bit special or a bit better. Scott spoke about how this created a sense of his mother's behaviour. So he would talk about his mother's more manic behaviour as the eccentricity of the upper classes, if you like, and to use his words, he'd describe her depressive episodes as the upper class ladies' malaise. Now, this explanation, in a way, allowed them, if you can imagine, to sort of distance themselves a bit from the stigma of mental illness. There was an element of denial there, but it also actually was important to help them cope in other ways, because it meant that they could hold on to a sense of their family identity through this, and in some way hold on to a sense of pride in their family. Okay, this is Adam. So another component of belief systems is spiritual and religious beliefs. And we found that there was often crossover here with creating a shared positive outlook within the family. Adam also grew up with a mother who was a single parent with bipolar. His belief in God and heaven really gave him a positive perspective on the things that were really hard in his life and hard for his mother. And this is what he had to say. We understood that difficulties were a result of the fallen world, and so therefore we weren't overly concerned. Where I think for somebody who believed that this life is their only hope of achieving their hopes and dreams, things going wrong would be a lot more upsetting. It made it all seem less important or less of a big deal. So for Adam, he really saw that for both he and his mother, their lives would actually continue on in heaven, where they would see that there would be a life without mental illness. And it was really important to them because it really helped them not become overly consumed by the difficulty of everyday life. Quite a few of our participants talked about the benefit of spirituality or having spirituality in their lives and having prayer as a source of comfort. Okay, so if we look a bit of organisational patterns, Froma Walsh would talk about the importance of flexibility, the importance of families being able to change their routines, rituals and roles where necessary to accommodate the adversity. Our participants spoke a lot about routines in their lives, but not necessarily in direct reference to flexibility, but there is some relationship there. Participants actually often spoke about having an unpredictable home life, in some cases chaotic. So this is Scott again. He would describe it as just really basic things like being picked up and dropped off. Mum would say, I will order you your lunch. But then that wouldn't happen, so we'd be waiting for lunch and there'd be no lunch. So there was just no consistency. I guess that goes with the territory of manic depression and sedatives. So this was actually really common, and for a lot of these adults, they will reflect that as children, it meant to them that their parents' mood was highly unpredictable. And I guess because of this unpredictability, it meant that everyday routines held a particular importance for these families. It sort of enabled them to function through the everyday life. Some of them spoke about having the importance of having a roast dinner every week or together every week, having a games night, having annual holidays where they could, have some time to connect as a family, have some time to develop and foster the relationships. So interestingly though, it was usually the other well parent stepping in, I guess, to ensure that consistency of routines and rituals and provide a bit of that stability in home life. So this is Lara. His mother also had bipolar. And you can see from her quote here how important her dad was in creating this stability. Dad was awesome. Like, he'd be late to work every single day, but I'd be at school. Dad providing that routine in the morning, and he'd be home at the same time every day. That was a little bit of stability in a world that was full of chaos and all that kind of thing. That was definitely a good thing. So But also we tended to find that in some families, the very strict routines had a bit of a negative side. In a way, it had the potential to mask some of the distress that might have been going on in the family due to mental illness. If you like, because the family was seen to be so organised, both they and others really didn't have any opportunity to sort of acknowledge what mightn't have been working, or not everyone in the family mightn't have been coping. So in a sense, what came from this sort of understanding is that there seemed to be a dual impact for these families over a number of these processes. There seemed to be both good and bad outcomes, or positive and negative, really not being clearly defined. And this was related to a theme that we saw frequently, that was that this sort of sense that hope and despair can sometimes coexist for these families. Okay, so many participants, and I'm sure this is common to a lot of people, many participants, including Penny, spoke about the family's fear of people outside the family knowing about their parents' mental illness. In fact, this was really common. Penny actually talked a bit about her mother having manic depression, but most of her stories, there's another one later on, are actually in relation to the impact of depression in her life, interestingly. So this is Penny. I told my aunt and uncle last year what was going on with my mother, and they didn't know. They had no idea the suffering I'd had. And 6 months later they phoned, and obviously it's been going on in their head, because they drove 3.5 hours to see me, took me out to lunch and said, "We've been thinking about what you said and we're just so sad and sorry." I was so moved and touched and shocked and relieved that they hadn't known. They hadn't actually abandoned me. So it was a big barrier for Penny's family to accessing social support. Both the children and the adults tended to participate, neither wanting to sort of involve outsiders, and in a way there was a sense of secrecy and isolation around the parents' mental illness. Interestingly, a lot of participants spoke about having a lot of people in their lives, lots of friends, extended family, church community, neighbours, but no one really spoke about these people as a source of support. Nor did they actually talk about service providers and the mental health system. So the third domain outlined by Fromer Walsh is about communication, and we actually find here that there's some overlap between talking about mental illness and the implications for social support, as I said before. Sally, who we talked about before, would often go to her father's place to stay when her mother became unwell. I suppose one of the big things that I disliked about the long times with Dad was that he sort of paid lip service to Mum in terms of respecting her and understanding her illness, but I felt like he didn't really understand this and didn't really support us through that. It was just normal for us to be there, but for me it was a stressful time, and I don't really think he got that. So Sally makes the point here relevant to both social support and communication. Many participants spoke about there being little or no communication about mental illness, and as children this created a lot of confusion for them, particularly about their parents' behaviour and interpreting their parents' behaviour. But also Sally points out here that it limited the extent to which the children could access support. So her father was a support to her, I guess, in terms of providing a place for her to stay, but their limited dialogue around mental illness meant that Sally actually didn't feel that supported by him. So, as you would expect, the way mental illness was or was not spoken about had a big impact on family relationships. And this is a quote from Penny again, asking her whether her family spoke about mental illness. "No, we were not allowed to, not at all. I knew she had depression. She said, I have these depressive episodes. I know that was what was said in our family. It was every 10 years. But it's not true it was every 10 years. I was in my 30s on the therapist's couch before I actually questioned that and said, oh, actually, this has been my whole life. I believed that it was only 10 years, and so why was it a problem? So what this quote tends to show is that there can be a big gap between the way in which mental illness is spoken about within the family and what might actually be going on. It's part of the theme that seemed to come out about denial or avoidance that we sort of touched on before. But for Penny, it was very difficult because it created a lot of confusion for her, and as she said, she would talk about it later on, that understanding her mental illness actually facilitated a much closer bond between her and her mother. Okay, so in Sally's family, actually, good communication about mental illness was there from the beginning, and as you'll see, it was a great help to the family, and in particular the mother. She's always been able to recognise where her limits are and when to seek help. I mean, not always. Obviously, when she was hospitalised and that sort of stuff that was beyond her capability, but generally. And the longer that she's been diagnosed, and especially the older we got, the more she was able to say, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do, and stick by it. So, as you can see in Sally's case, her mother was really, and Sally was too, actually quite articulate in what was going on for them in terms of the illness. And it really did help Sally make a lot of sense about what was happening in the family. Okay, so I think I want to sort of touch on a bit of the clinician data that we've really started to look at in the last couple of months. Essentially we want to report on two questions that we ask them. So what they describe as the key issues for families where a parent has a mental illness, and what helps families cope and manage the challenges of living with a mental illness. What I'm going to present to you is two diagrams. One's going to be the themes that have come out that are the hindering factors, and another slide to follow that is the resilience promoting factors, if you like. So I guess to have a look at what I'm talking about here, essentially what comes out a lot is that these families, they may not have all of these factors, but these families tend to have to work quite hard against a number of strains and stresses. One clinician talked about how mental illness can strip a family of their natural resources to adapt. So given what families are up against, I think it's really important for us to remember that they are quite resourceful and quite determined, and their perseverance is quite remarkable at times. As we would know, like I'll just go through each of these, the impact of stigma can be quite profound. It can be inside or outside the family. There's also self-stigma as well. It can actually lead to the family feeling quite disempowered, reduce their capacity to seek help, lead to isolation, and then this sense of lack of role legitimacy. So a lot of the parents I speak to in my research talk about how there's almost this assumption that they're a bad parent because they're trying to parent with a mental illness. There's also social isolation that can come from the actual symptoms and medication. People might not just want to mix with people because of the nature of their illness. It can lead to a distancing of support. Mental illness can also invite a bit of a blaming framework where, unlike, I guess, other perceived medicalised illnesses, if you like, there is sometimes a personal attribution of the illness to the person. There's also the case that it mightn't be just the person with the mental illness, but also the family can feel a sense of blame as well. And children in particular as well, especially when they don't understand what's going on. In my interviews with children, a lot of the time they'll talk about if only I was a good boy or a good girl, that sort of stuff. So there was a sense that their parents' behaviour was because of them. A lot of families talk about how there's so much unpredictability with mental illness, how there can be sometimes repeated instances of crisis. Sometimes that can wear the family down. In severe cases, it can lead to issues with sort of hope for the future. If there is a lot of trauma, often there can be sort of hypervigilance that develops in watching people's behaviour and triggers and things like that. So some families are also kind of living in the moment, as you would expect, living in the moment of the crisis, and find it hard to sort of reflect on what's going on. I think when we talk about resilience, we really need to think about how it's so dependent on being able to reflect on how you're going, and so it's often difficult to know that you're being resilient at the time of a crisis and things like that. There's also often with these families numerous services involved, usually numerous services in dealing with individual family members, very little sort of collaboration. There's financial and housing instability or pressures that come from that. And there's also a number of, I guess all of these factors really are really straining family relationships. People talk about a sense of a change in relationships, changes in roles and things like that, and they can experience a sense of grief and loss and trauma, a fear of where the family may end up when there may be repeated impacts, and also a need to sort of readjust family roles when people transition in and out. So parents, for instance, talk about the need to maintain their parenting role when hospitalised in a psychiatric sort of hospital, but that they might also need a bit of assistance to step back into that role in the family home. So the themes quickly for what helps families cope with the challenges. There's really this overarching theme, and I've seen it a lot in the interviews, that families talk about sort of coming together and binding together and sort of marshalling against the threat or adversity facing the family, I guess. And it's something that I hear a lot, and I sort of, when you ask people about the good things in their family, having that strong bond to approach the adversity together is really something that comes out pretty strong. I also wonder if that is the growth through adversity that people talk about, that sort of commitment to family. Clinicians also talk about the family developing or having a sense of belonging, having strong attachment relationships, parent-child attachment being one. And they talk about, a strong sense of love being a really important motivator for all. Having a family belief system where the family can come to accept the illness is also shown to be important. Understanding what to expect is important. It helps counteract that lack of hope in the future. Good communication within the family is actually essential to a majority of things. In particular, communication around mental illness, making sense of the illness, importantly having a language to engage with others and children to engage with others. Having practical resources, of course, so having other people available, having money to choose the services that you might want to have. Clinicians also talk about acknowledging a family's resourcefulness, perseverance, determination and courage. They talk about the importance of acknowledging this maybe at the time of crisis as well, and talk about sort of witnessing an innate drive to give up as another sort of component. The capacity to seek help, so that's both families being able to reach out but also permit help as well, so let people in. Now, scaling is actually an important concept that seems to really come up when we're trying to understand resilience and recovery. It sort of suggests to us that these concepts are very much associated with a sense of time or journey through time. Now, it can have a negative edge, I guess, if there's repeated traumatic incidences that might leave people a bit hypervigilant, but it also can be advantageous where you can sometimes move a bit beyond that sort of narrow focus that the crisis tends to draw you into. And you might be able to see that you're doing a bit better this time, sort of compared to before. So scaling is actually a really important quality. And lastly, there's being able to see the mental illness as external to the family and its members, sort of separate the illness from the person or the family, and sort of try and avoid that disempowerment that can come from a blaming framework. So just quickly, some helpful strategies that people can do. Providing families with relevant information about mental illness, facilitating family discussions about mental illness, recognising those family strengths. They're also important. I haven't really talked about this, but there's really some important findings coming out on programs that really get families to talk to each other about their experience. So hearing the lived experience of other families, being able to normalise their stresses, and it sort of is suggested that it creates a sense of hope as well. I think the important thing to remember from this work is that, clinicians may have to start by really hearing or acknowledging a family's negative experience to really create that space to recognise strengths within the family. So sort of in summary, we find that family resilience is quite a useful framework. It's encouraging us to ask about, what's going on in families from the perspective of what's working rather than not working. We know that that from this research, the mental illness cuts across all aspects of family resilience as defined by Walsh. It's central to a family's experience and influences their ability to adapt. The challenge for us now as researchers is to translate this thinking into developing family recovery interventions. We think the starting block might be this model, let's talk about children. So these are our partners I just want to touch a little bit and thank the partners, and also we're doing a randomised control trial over 4 years about this intervention. The intervention was developed in Finland by a psychiatrist called Tutti Salantis, and there were some references at the start that talk about it, but it's a 2 to 3 session intervention for parents that are attending a mental health service. So they do it as a collaborative process with their practitioner, exploring the needs of the children, the impact of mental health, and the supports that they might need in their parenting role and for their child's well-being. We've actually been looking at what we think the core elements of this model might be, and essentially we're so attracted to it, I guess, because it's really about empowering the parent around the parenting role. It's not an assessment. It's sort of a process of change. As you can see here, it's sort of awareness raising, strengthening their confidence, and reflective action. It sort of encourages them to make changes in their family to support their own well-being as parents, but also their children, support the parent-child relationship. Also, it's about equipping the parent to have conversations with their children and other family members about mental health issues. What we also find in some of the early research is talking about how clinicians go through a period of change as well. So they experience what's known as sort of clinician joy, which we didn't really understand before, but now we see that they go through, you can see here, a process of development as well. And through this, there's sort of this mutual trust that sort of develops and respect that develops that really changes the therapeutic relationship. So, there's really this great change that happens, that there is a change in action later on. I think I'm running out a bit of time, so I just wanted to reiterate that that program is freely available, and there's an online e-learning course available for that too. And I just wanted to finish by flagging or drawing your attention to a book that's just been released for children and parents with bipolar disorder. It's written by children's author Michelle Vassalou, who's really drawing on her own experience of being a mother with bipolar disorder. It's quite, I think the book launch is today. It's quite a fantastic resource, and I think you can find it through Job Publishing. Okay, great. And there's my contact details if you've got any questions or you want to contact me. So thank you for listening today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Goodyear, for insightful research. And certainly if anyone has any questions right now, please on your control panel. I'll be here to share those with Dr. Goodyear, so we will give you a few.
I can't really hear anything. Sorry. Hang on. Debbie, were you saying something then?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. There is a question. What can you tell us Dr. Walsh's first name?
Froma Walsh. She's written a lot about family resilience as a concept, and she's got some articles that are available, but also a book, or 2 books, I think. And she will talk a lot about adversity, sometimes in the cases of a once-off adversity for families, chronic disease, and talks a little bit about mental illness as well.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer.
She's from Chicago, I believe.
Any additional questions? Also, you see Dr. Goodyear's email address, or you can certainly email me if you think of something after the fact, and I will be sure to pass that on to her. Remind also again that this is recorded and it will be posted on our website so that you can watch it at a later time or share it with someone else and can watch it at their convenience. I see that we have no additional questions, so we're going to go ahead and close. Thank you so much, Dr. Goodyear, again, and everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks, Debbie.